Voice of Geekdom is now on Patreon. Please check out the link in the description to find out how you could gain access to premium content and social features. Hello, Tolkien geeks, and welcome back to Voice of Geekdom. Welcome back to the podcast, and I'm joined today by my good friend Helen, aka the Clueless Fangirl, aka the face that launched 1,000 ships. And we have a new debutante to the channel today. It's Lexi from Girl Next Gondor, which is my favourite channel name in Tolkien YouTube, I think, currently, at least. Lexi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
And
it's
one
a pleasure
of our
to have you.
favorite people as well, not just the name.
Aw, you guys. You can't see it,
I'm
but I'm blushing.
a fan. This is the first time we've spoken, but I'm a fan. Like, honestly, your channel's a breath of fresh air. I love your sense of humour and the way that you deliver facts and the way that you don't take things too seriously, but you do have a genuine love for the Legendarium. It's a really, really great channel that I recommend that people check out. I don't have anybody on my channel that I don't respect, so...
Except Helen.
Well, we have a different kind of relationship like that, where I can make fun of you, but you know I respect you too.
It's a deep regard.
So today is the second part of my mini-series that I've begun on the Middle-earth races, and so I've put together a kind of crack team of different influencers and social media people and YouTubers, content creators who I know from the fandom, and I know have an interest in these particular races for whatever reason. And so the purpose of this discussion is just to dig into what do you guys feel you respond to in terms of the way that these races are represented on the page and what makes them interesting, what makes them tick in a literary sense. So we are, of course, here to talk elves with the two of you. And you two have spent a lot of time talking about elves together. I haven't watched all of the content that you've done together, but you guys are a match made in heaven when it comes to this subject. So I'm particularly excited for this one. I think as the debutante to the channel, let's start with you, Lexi. What do you love about the elves? Like, straight up, what comes to mind, and why do you enjoy the elves?
Yeah, I was giving this some thought because the easy answer is they're very pretty. You know, they do cool stuff. They're immortal. They never get sick. So there's a little bit of a wish fulfillment aspect to it, where somewhere deep down we all want to be really cool and always know what to say, and like our memory is perfect and we don't have to worry about ever, getting old. So I think there's an element of just elves are easy to love, and I think Tolkien made them be easy to love and to admire. I also think it maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. It may go deeper than that because, of course, there's dwarves, which are really cool, and a lot of people are very invested.
Of course, there's dwarves, which are really cool.
And a lot of people are very invested in hobbits, and men are not to be discarded either, especially Númenorians, I know in particular, have a growing fan base. So the easy answer is, well, elves are cool. Why wouldn't you love them? They're wonderful, but clearly there's got to be something else going on under the surface.
So what is going on under the surface then? I want to pick up on one thing you said, which was that elves have a perfect memory. Let's just laser focus on that for a second, because you've just created a video on the Nature of Middle-earth book, which discusses this a little bit, the memory issue, and how elves age their Theyre ages by taking on more memories, which kind of weighs them down over time. And it's because of that perfect recall, I think, that there's a kind of double-edged sword thing going on with the memory thing, where, the length of time and the immortality and the sort of the lifespan of the elf kind of drags them down. And you see that particularly with the Third Age elves, I would say.
For sure.
In the Lord of the Rings, you get to the point with the Third Age elves, especially with Galadriel. She talks about fighting the long defeat and stuff, where there's this kind of sorrow there as well. And I think that's interesting in a literary sense. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think the other thing for Tolkien too is, and this gets overlooked a lot, I think, when we're talking about the differing fates of elves and men and the quote, the gift of men being able to leave the world forever. But there's another side to that where it seems that elves and their characters are more fixed, and that's related, I think, to the fact that their souls are aging through the accumulation of experience upon experience upon experience. Well, after a certain point, you've experienced kind of everything that there is to experience, and you're just starting to see things repeat. And to a more limited outside perspective, like a human perspective where we only really have one lifetime's worth of experience, we're probably only going to see certain things happen once or twice, and they're going to be very different each time. Elves are going to have seen almost every permutation of most events. So, like, as you referred to, the long defeat, how many times has Galadriel in particular, being one of the oldest characters, seen some variation, and here we go, variation on the theme, which is a loaded figure of speech in the Legendarium because of the way the world being created and the sort of plan for history being referred to as the great theme. I think that's kind of a problem for the elves, where they get locked into, after a certain point, they're locked into this role of just being observers. Which, like you said, is interesting from a literary perspective, because how do you really, especially like you said in the Third Age and beyond that, we don't see any more of the elves. Well, as a writer, what could you do with them at that point? They can't show any more character development. They can't shake things up. They can't experience anything new like a Hobbit could. So they're kind of, so this is loops all the way around to my ultimate conclusion, which is that First Age elves are the best, and the Sons of Feanor are the most novel and novelty-seeking of all elves ever, and are superior, and we should just all give them our allegiance.
Fair enough. So it's the Noldor that you love the most, is it, of the three? I think Tolkien, we have very little information really about the Vanir and the Teleri and the Sindar even. Helen and I got into, we kind of milked them, I think, for as much information and implication as we could get out of them. But Tolkien wrote a lot more about the Noldor. We know a lot more about the Noldor, and the Noldor have a very active character to their people. They take action. They don't just stand by. There's even a note, I forget, I think it might be in Nature of Middle-earth, where the Sindar observed that, the Noldor, they need a lot of room to quarrel. They need to get out and have their little fights, and that's just kind of how they are. So the Noldor are my favorite, but that may just be because we don't know enough. For example, I think the Mirkwood elves, the little that we know about them is fascinating. Being very reclusive and secretive and following their own. Tolkien says in The Hobbit that they're dangerous. Like, what does that mean? So yeah, the Noldor. But again, I'm flexible.
Yeah, but they're most like us, and this is, I think, although to Tolkien, but also to us, because they're very relatable. They're stories we have, gone through. Like, we had family strives, I mean, probably didn't kill each other, hopefully, knock on wood, but, we had all this, we experienced all this. They are like, the heroes of a Greek tragedy. They could be a family out of a Greek tragedy, right? And this is what makes them so very interesting. And I do think Tolkien created three races of elves to distinguish them. So these ones are the closest to God, to the god-like creatures, to the angel-like creatures. This is literally why they moved up to basically living up on Taniquetil, the holy mountain in the Undying Lands. But he wanted to distinguish them, so to tell us they're not all the same, right? Just as humanity are not all the same. So I think that is fascinating, and I think the Noldor, he did write most about them because it's easier to write about, what you yourself experience, and you obviously, that's the most interesting story. I always refer to, look, we know more actually about hell and about evil things than we know about good things, right? We know less about heaven than we know about hell. Why is that? I mean, first of all, you want a good story. Heaven is probably pretty boring. But that's very similar to the Noldor and the Vanyar, for example. So this is why I like the Noldor the best, because they are not perfect, and I don't want elves to be perfect, because then they could be gods, right? I mean, not Greek gods, obviously. They are different. They're worse than us. But, gods in Tolkien's world. Yeah.
So the Noldor, they certainly do have that narrative conflict that's built into their storyline. An early working title for the Silmarillion was the Quenta Noldorinwa, which was the history of the Noldor. But the Silmarillion basically is the history of the Noldor, and the other cultures, I think, are kind of peripheral to the narrative in many ways. Although it's kind of a unreliable narrator thing that's going on in the Silmarillion a little bit as well, because we get stories about men, but we get those stories from an Elvish perspective.
But you can define a character by telling us what other characters do and are like. So this is how your character, is defined. And so you need these other clans of elves to flesh out the Noldor. Their difference.
A lot of the basis for the Elvish storyline as well is linguistic as well, which is really, really fascinating. And that kind of the development of the languages influenced the development of the history of the elves and vice versa. So the two worked in tandem, which is interesting to consider. Tolkien was very obsessed with his invented languages from an early age in life. We get passages in Elvish in the Lord of the Rings, which I think fascinates a lot of people, draws a lot of readers in early on, because it feels very alien and very unique. And he was very interested with sounds as well, and how the words sounded and so on, which gives that kind of aesthetic that I think I've always responded to.
This is why he creates these beautiful words, which actually, I mean, like, I don't know. It doesn't come. An example doesn't come to me now. But when he gives things names, they make sense. You understand it without even understanding the language, and it makes sense that this thing is named that. So this is so cool, and this is the sound of. I mean, studied literature, so this is the sound of that particular word, and it's so fascinating. This is why I think a lot of people have problems with people pronouncing things, because it changes a word completely, right?
We as content creators all deal with this.
I have a special section in all of my descriptions where if I mispronounced a word, I put it there that says, yes, I know, it should be this, based on Appendix F, Note 4.
Tolkien himself did that, right? He admitted, I'm not always, pronouncing stuff correctly. I mean,
There's great controversy that rages over recordings of him, reciting things in Elvish, and people will say, well, he pronounced it this way. Does that mean that did he change his mind on this? It's like, or, maybe the guy's inventing a language and he doesn't always remember exactly how he should pronounce according to his own rules, which, changed from week to week.
Yeah. And it's if you speak in another language, because when he tells you the story, because the story is written in English, in modern day English, right? And then you're just, on a roll, on a flow, especially me, as this is not even my native language. So this is why I'm very confused, and people are like, what is her problem? But, you have to imagine, like, this is my bad language, basically. So Tolkien must have, when he was speaking, when he was telling a lot of things and reciting stuff and whatnot, and then had to bring in the Elvish parts. That's hard for our brains, to do that. And sometimes I don't always say Galadriel. I try, but if I'm in a rush, in a flow, I don't. And this must have been the same for him, even though he invented it. It's like, normal.
Well, Tolkien didn't even speak English particularly clearly.
No, I was going to say this. When he narrates his own stories, when you hear his recordings, they're not always the best quality.
But it's a quality as well. I mean, it was like in the 50s and 60s.
Some of his students would give him grief over the fact that I guess he would go have these long pauses that didn't seem to make sense with what he was saying, and then all of a sudden everything would come out in rush, and he would be saying 5 or 6 different things really, really fast and really, really indistinctly, and his poor students are like desperately trying to take notes so they can pass their exams. It's like, Professor, slow down.
When he recites poetry and the songs and things, he does it so fast as well. So fast. There's a version of the Galadriel's lament from The Lord of the Rings that he recorded. It's just completely illegible. You just can't understand what he's. I mean, even if you knew the words, you wouldn't be able to understand it.
In jag vill inte julmar vanier mjör och marille simmer och vareva. Andone bella vardo tellumar, noloin jasentin till arielne, och Mario aritarierinan.
Let's go back to the original question and talk about Helen and why you respond to elves and what you find interesting about them.
Okay, so first of all, just as Lexi, or a lot of people, I am obviously fascinated by this immortality thing, right? But for me, I always say, I grew up on fairy tales. My mother read, Grimm's fairy tales, Gebrüder Grimm, and the Sindbad stories and all that. She read that to me as when I was a child, and so I grew up with the knowledge of fairy, right? This is what Tolkien, and I really love that he invented a new form of fairy, because you have, in ancient tales and folklore, and you have a lot of different variations of fairy, but this specific fairies, the elves he introduces to this world is so cool, because for me the fairies were always mere side characters, little helpers. They never had a real story. They don't in these greater tales and stories and mythologies. Maybe some does, so somebody will come at me in the comment section, but whatever, like the majority doesn't. And I always found that sad, because I always liked things that are different and not like me, and I wanted to understand stuff, when I was a little girl, and I was fascinated by that, and I was always so sad. But why don't they? What does he do when he goes to bed, or what does Tinkerbell like? What's her favorite color and stuff like that, And I never got that. But with Tolkien and the Silmarillion, we get that. And I love this new, fantasy elf element, which later on was even developed. We have bad elves, we have elven warrior. I mean, we have warriors in Silmarillion as well, but like races that are born and bred as warrior elves. And I really love that he invented this new form of elves and immortality. This is like the first thing, because, I'm very superstitious. I'm from East Europe, I'm Jewish, so I like all these things. But the thing is, I really always liked the aspect of these elves. Oh, cheers, Dan. Have a good one. I always liked the aspect of them not just being perfect. And you have that feeling, in the Lord of the Ring books. And this is why I always tell, people, read the Silmarillion if you like elves and want to know more about elves, because they are so three-dimensional. They're grey, they're not black and white, and they're not knights in shining armors or, whatever. They are so, like we talked about the Vanyar, Noldor, all these different races. Even in one family, you have so many different characters. And I like the sadness he adds to the elves, because you would think, as a reader, I mean, I love Anne Rice vampires, right? I'm very into vampires. So you're like, oh, cool, they're immortal, they kill people kind of in a cool way, and so immortality is different, in variations of mythology. You almost never have the aspect of this sadness, and this is what Lexi mentioned before, the thing of the gift of men. They don't have that. They literally can't die. I mean, yes, they can in battle and these things, but it's very different. So them being in this world that is slowly dying, because yes, one day it will die. This sadness comes on top of, okay, so I'm immortal, but Eru gave me this, Tolkien's God gave me this as well. So, nothing is perfect. They have this sadness. So there are so many aspects that don't make them boring. And I really like that Tolkien all gave that to this one race. He developed lots of really cool other races, but this makes it very special and relatable for me, because I was always interested in these things personally.
I think it's very clear that the elves were, his main love. I think it's fair to say. I think he loved other parts of the legendary, like other races. He enjoyed writing about the hobbits. He enjoyed writing about men. But it's clear that the elves were, the genesis of the thing.
The genesis, exactly. Yeah.
And he kept coming back to it. He's kept trying to rewrite the Silmarillion until his deathbed, near enough. He was still writing about Galadriel 2 months from his death.
That's why we have like 100 versions of her.
Trying so hard to figure that one out.
So what are some of our favorite stories? Let's go to that. So we all love the Silmarillion here. I mean, I'm kind of known for being the Silmarillion dude on YouTube. Like, my fans are always like, when's your next Silmarillion video? I'll get to it. I'll try.
I'll get to it.
So I know you, Helen. I know you love the Silmarillion. I know it's your favorite of the three major works. What's your favorite sort of elven story in the Silmarillion? Which is, the whole thing is an elven story, but let's go to Lexi, actually, because I don't know the answer.
Because I don't. It's probably gonna be lined up pretty well with Helen's. I'm a big Gondolin sucker. In terms of contained story, that's the one that I think is the most moving. It's got the best sort of. Helen will get into it. She'll explain all the reasons why The Fall of Gondolin is fantastic, and you have to read the version that's in the Book of Lost Tales, and I don't care. There's no other version. Mechanized dragons that spew orcs out of their holes, like, I don't care. That's the best version. It is my canon. The other thing, so I'll leave that one for Helen, because I know she has some good points on it. It's my favorite contained story, but I think the thing that I like thinking about the most in terms of the little elves off doing their things is the difference between the Noldor in Aman on the eve of their departure, where they're so wrapped up in their own little petty feuds, and he stepped on my side of the street, and my helmet has 2 plumes, yours only has 1. It's kind of like the Capulets and the Montagues. They're just feuding and fighting. And of course, this is another part of the immortality aspect, because they're all immortal. They're all like begetting their problems onto the next generation in perpetuity. So poor Celebrimbor knows his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather. Presumably, I don't know if any of Muriel's or Nerdnell's family goes back farther, but he's got generations of trauma just laden on him, and they're all still alive and yelling at him. At least for a while, they're all still alive. That changes very quickly. So the difference between that kind of society and then how quickly it changes, I guess that loss of innocence, and then what it must have been like for the survivors of the First Age who decided to return, the idea that they've been out in the world and they've faced down Middle-earth Satan, basically, for centuries, and they've met men, and they've met dwarves, and they've killed each other, and they've chased people off cliffs, and it's horrible. And then they get to return provisionally to sort of the edges of paradise, where the Vanyar and the Teleri have had a radically different experience of the past millennia, and just the story of the fall, which Tolkien refers to. He says they actually had not a fall in the sense that men had a fall where they all sort of became corrupt, but the elves had a loss of innocence as well, and that colors all the rest of their history that we know of.
Yeah, and like, you know, losing paradise, they're not being allowed back to paradise, right? This is like very tragic.
Losing paradise, and then some of them kind of being allowed to stand on the edges and look back in, to me is a really painful sort of twist to the narrative.
Yeah. And then, you know, some try to redeem their deeds, right? Even though they were not willingly and knowingly even doing them. That's also really cool. Yeah.
Fingon, I'm thinking about when you say that. We talked about him a little bit recently when we talked to Fingolfin, his dad. Fingon's story actually is one of my favourite moments in the Silmarillion, which I think goes underrated a lot of time, actually. This story when he rescues Maedhros, I think it's a great moment. It's really quick, actually. It's not like long to read. It's just several paragraphs, but it's just very exciting the way it plays out.
Yeah.
Straight out of Greek mythology, as we said on your channel as well.
I'm trying to get down into Greek mythology. Lexi, when is your birthday? You'll get a Greek mythology book from me.
Oh, you've just missed it. That's okay.
No.
I know. I have.
That's all right, though. She missed mine by about 6 months. So.
Not 6 months. Oh, true.
Well, she's just 6 months early in that case.
Exactly.
Don't worry.
So that means I won't get anything next year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, shut up. So you're Virgo, Lexi, right?
I'm technically, are we doing old astrology or new astrology? Because a few years ago they threw in Ophiuchus and they set everyone back
This is what I get for inviting girls on my channel.
Shut up. So Lexi, continue.
Technically I'm a Leo, but that...
Ooh!
I know, it's very odd. I don't know that I necessarily am a typical Leo.
Dream-maker planet Neptune and Venus spin fortunes for Scorpio and Capricorn, and someone who bought a ticket at 6 p.m. today. The power of the pendulum is spelling out Pat and Kathy as winning names.
All I know is I turn to the back of the newspaper every week or so and they say, "You're going to have a terrible day." I say, "Thank you. I could have guessed that."
No.
All I know is that,
you know, I mean,
anytime somebody says the word retrograde for me, I want to run and hide in a closet.
Always, like, you know, I have a friend who has a tarot channel, and it's literally always some retrograde. So
something's always retrograde.
Yeah, I call it Gatorade, and you know, like drink it up and have a good time.
So people, elves.
So elves.
So I want to switch from the Silmarillion for a second and talk the Hobbit for just a moment. And I actually want to read a passage. So most people's first Tolkien book, I don't know if this is true of you, Lexi, but I know it's true of Helen. Most people's first Tolkien book is The Hobbit. Yeah. And the very first time we meet the elves is when they're coming into Rivendell. And
like
Gandalf.
This first was Morgoth's ring.
No.
Morgoth's ring.
I was the Hobbit when I was around 10 or 11, perfect age for it, and then it took me like 5 tries to get through the Council of Elrond. I could not, for the life of me, finish Fellowship. But yes, read about because this is my favorite, the Rivendell elves.
Yes, so I'm going to read the passage as they're coming into the valley. Bilbo never forgot the way they slithered and slipped in the dusk down the steep zigzag path into the secret valley of Rivendell. The air grew warmer as they got lower, and the smell of the pine trees made him drowsy, so that every now and again he nodded and nearly fell off, or bumped his nose on the pony's neck. Their spirits rose as they went down and down. The trees changed to beech and oak, and there was a comfortable feeling in the twilight. The last green had almost faded out of the grass when they came at length to an open glade not far above the banks of the stream. It smells like elves, thought Bilbo, and he looked up at the stars. They were burning bright and blue. Just then there came a burst of song like laughter in the trees. And you guys know what comes next.
Yes.
I'm not gonna sing to you because I just can't do that on my channel with people watching. But we get the Tra-la-la-lally song, which is most people's first moment of being introduced to the elves. I think as an adult, I read the Tra-la-la-lally song as being, Bilbo being quite inventive with his narrative here because he's writing. I think the Hobbit is written for Hobbit children by Bilbo, and there's an unreliable narrator thing going on where he's kind of using a little bit of artistic license with the way he's telling the story. That's my opinion.
What was he writing for when he was, writing down the mythology of the Silmarillion? Because that was also Bilbo.
That was also Bilbo, and that was for a different audience. I think that was more of a scholarly pursuit for him.
And that was translations.
In one book, and yes, it's translations, but it was all in one book. And you can translate things for children. There are Bibles for children that are, use different words. But it was,
and this is, when we meet Sam as well in the Lord of the Rings, Sam was taught his letters by Mr. Bilbo, wasn't he? So this is what we're getting in the Hobbit, I think, which it kind of explains the Hobbit elves being as silly and irreverent as they are. In my opinion. But my question, and I'm going to have to ask Lexi this question, and we'll maybe have to explain why it has to go to Lexi, but what do elves smell like?
Well, what sort of elf do you mean?
Well, Rivendell elves.
Okay, well,
Bilbo's never smelt an elf, as far as I'm aware. He who smelt it dealt it, as they say.
Keep in mind that he's just described how the smell of pine trees is making him drowsy, and they're coming down into a valley near a river in midsummer, I believe it is, and it's June. So I believe, based on that, Bilbo's opinion on what an elf smells like, because again, we have to remember that this is Bilbo perhaps taking some licenses or giving his opinions. Would elves smell like Rivendell elves in particular, which would be, of course, a very cosmopolitan mix of, you've got some Sindar in there, you got some Sylvans, you got probably some Feanorian partisans hiding out under assumed names. So,
like Nazis in Argentina or something.
Covering up the 8-pointed star tattoo. You can't convince me otherwise. You got a random Gondolinian reincarnate, so Glorfindel's floating around there. Apparently, that mixture of elves smells like hot pine forest next to a river. Is my conclusion. Now, why did this have to go through me?
Oh, well, do you want me to say, Helen, or do you want to explain?
No, you can say it.
Helen has no sense of smell. She couldn't. Is it an infection that you had when you were a kid? I think.
Yeah.
That's the explanation you gave me.
Something in my brain.
So Helen, if she ever encountered an elf,
so we could bring you
wouldn't
an
be
elf.
able to smell them.
Bring the elf. Bring the elf. Yeah.
No, bring me the elf. I can smell him. This conversation has taken a turn.
Yeah. I don't know if Dan likes it though. Doubt it.
He started it.
It's true.
I did. I started it by inviting the two of you here.
You knew what you were in for.
But let's talk about Rivendell, because I want to get into Rivendell. This is why I brought this up, really, because Rivendell, I think, is our introduction to the Elven world for many of us, anyway, as first-time readers. And Rivendell feels like kind of mini Gondolin in a way. It's like it's in a hidden valley. It's cosmopolitan, as you say, just like Gondolin was. It was a mix of Sindar and Noldor, and it's run by Elrond, who is one of the most interesting characters in the Legendarium. And we're told that he's kind as Christmas in the first edition Hobbit, because this was before Tolkien decided he wanted to expunge all references to Christianity. Just Rivendell just, I think, captures the imagination wonderfully, and it has that timeless feeling that it is kind of a theme within the elves. If they create these pockets of kind of magically preserved timelessness in the places that they live. And that's that entering fairy thing that Tolkien does very often, where you come to a certain place within the story, and you come to an elven stronghold, and you're just suddenly in this magical world that you're pulled into this timeless world, and everything feels different. And it's very magical. It works wonderfully well in a children's narrative, which is why I think it's a big part of the reason why the middle section of The Hobbit works so well, is the elves.
Yeah,
and we see the dark side of that with Mirkwood. What are your recollections and kind of interests?
It's more magical. It's not dark. I don't find Mirkwood's description dark. I find it rather fascinating, and like more the magic element comes, with them disappearing and all. Like that's the magical side of the elves. Although you would think,
But it's not like a homely house, though, is it? It's more of a. Well, I mean, I suppose it's because of the way the narrative goes, and they get imprisoned by the elves. But
yeah. It's more how the hobbits feel about it. It's not how the elves feel about it. But yeah, I do think, it is very different. And I do think somebody like a Noldor would build a house very differently. And we see that basically, in them when they burn down Aqualonde, right? This is what Fëanor even tells all were. So they build houses different. They, it's like, strong foundations, they have the dwarves helping them to dig, and this is a different image, like the woodland realm. They probably, they don't live in trees. I know that, but it's very similar to Menegroth. So it's very, with nature. And I do think, yes, Elrond also had that, and they with the river element is very, very Teleri as well. But still, and the river, is what the water is what the elves love, especially the Teleri. Although I would count Elrond amongst the Noldor, mainly. And, so I find this contrast really cool, but I don't find it's more the description of how the hobbits feel about Mirkwood. But I think Mirkwood is really cool because it's so different. It's like living with nature, in nature, taking just what you need. And I think Rivendell is different. It's like our houses would be, like our kingdoms would be.
Well, there's also the point that Mirkwood it hasn't always been Mirkwood. It used to be Greenwood. It used to be much more an unsullied place, and now it's sort of overrun with spiders, and it's got Nazgul and potentially at times Sauron himself hanging out in it and spreading evil and infection throughout it, which I think makes it seem especially inhospitable. So the elves are kind of in this bind, which they end up in quite often, where they've given their heart to this place, and they've, again, especially Sylvan and Sindarin, they've grown up with the natural world, and their hearts are given to their realm, and they're living in it and with it, and then something happens and it becomes corrupt, and it sort of sickens and turns dark, and they can't really do anything about it. They have to stay, and they're still in love with their home.
Yeah.
Elves are more hyper-conscious of the Ard-Mard concept in that way, aren't they? Where, because of their connection to the earth and the land and the places that they inhabit, as you just described, they cut to the issue of the fact that this is a fallen world, I suppose. Not so much in The Hobbit, because it's not obvious in The Hobbit.
No.
The Hobbit is borrowing from the Silmarillion, like, very largely. I mean, I just called Rivendell mini Gondolin, and Mirkwood is mini Menegroth, really.
Even the story about the elves and the dwarves don't get along, because long ago the Elven King, who at this point is still just called the Elven King, he got into a labor dispute with the dwarves over the setting of his white gems in
Lasgullen.
This is the story of Thingol and the dwarves arguing about the Nauglamir, just with all the words removed. And this is The Hobbit was written back when Tolkien still presumably thought that the Silmarillion wasn't necessarily going to be published.
True, but this is also, you can also argue, this is the memories of the elves. And why did Thranduil rebuild the halls where he probably was born in? He's probably a very close, his father was Orofer, was probably very close related to Thingol. And so therefore I assume Thranduil was born there, so, he has all that in memory, so he rebuilds it from memory. Gondolin, the same. I mean, yes, obviously Elrond wasn't born in Gondolin, but his father was, right? Earendil was. Mm-hmm. His mother was the princess of Gondolin, and, his father was her husband who came to Gondolin. And so and then he rebuilds something in that image, like we do that, right? Humanity does that. So it could be the memory, it's not just,
And from a sort of meta perspective, it's interesting to consider how, again, when Tolkien was writing about Mirkwood and Rivendell, he didn't necessarily have the Lord of the Rings in mind. He didn't know that he was going to have to retrofit this. So, I think this is super cool because he finds a way to reason. For example, Thranduil, okay, why is he basically rebuilt Menegroth? Well, Tolkien does a little cutting and pasting and a little additional writing, and he explains it away.
Oh, he does a lot of that, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I said a little, yeah. No, a ton of writing and explaining away, and his explanation that he's forced into by this juxtaposition is really cool. The idea that Thranduil is sort of rejecting what's come before, and he's like, no, we got it wrong when we started associating with Noldor and dwarves and building houses, and we just need to return to a simple life in the woods, and that's why he and his father migrate east, and they don't even want anything to do with Celeborn and Galadriel. That's very poorly understood. This is a story that's not, like you referenced earlier, he was still rewriting the story of Galadriel and her history and what all she did up until essentially months before his death. So we don't have a really good understanding of what his final decision on that would have been, which leads to many heated arguments and lots of speculation on the internet, which is great. It's great fun. But it's way more interesting to have that than to say just, oh yeah, I didn't realize at the time. It's kind of an unfortunate coincidence. No, Tolkien was like, no, we're going to make this work. And what he came up with was often just leagues more interesting than a simple cop-out would have been.
Yeah. He was a genius at retcon. I think he was the best retcon I can think of in literary history. I mean, the Lord of the Rings is just one big exercise in retcon in many ways, and he used the you talked about cut and pasting. He ended up, we're not here to talk about men, but he ended up using the Númenor material that he created for an abandoned novel to kind of bridge the gap there. And it's just we'll get off topic if we start talking about Númenor.
And then he gave, Denethor's sons the dreams, and so it all connected. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, imagine Middle Earth without Númenor.
The elves also, they affect the culture of men as well. Maybe we should think about that a little bit as well, because when we get down to Gondor, we learn that the Gondorians actually speak Elvish. Like there's Elvish language is kind of their second language, and there's an Elvishness to their whole culture, which is kind of dying out, and it's waning, and it's becoming less prevalent in Gondorian culture. But it's a callback to the earlier age where there was the great elf friends and so on, and that's where Númenor kind of bridges the gap there.
But I think this is more, for me, that was always more the court life aspect of it, because this is like in European courts, they, like your rulers, or even, the Prussian kings, they spoke French. Why the F did they speak French, right? I mean, yes, the Brits, you were ruled once, but blah, 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 but literally the Prussians, like my ancestors, like, oh, why are we speaking French? Just because we want to read Voltaire? No, Frederick the Great. But, this is very, like, it was just common to speak that language in court. And I also do think that was a big factor how Tolkien presented it, even with the, what they used, what the Númenorian kings used as a, how's it called, prefix, like the tar.
Yeah, the R's and the Tars.
I guess you could call that a prefix.
Prefix. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that is also, very reminiscent. So it's not like, and I do think the elite spoke that. I think that that's a big factor. And I don't think, random, because in Númenor, I don't know if everybody knows that, but there were kind of different races. There were even dwarves apparently living. I haven't read the book yet, so please don't spoil me. I don't know if that is in the new book.
Maybe there were a few dwarves. I mean, there was Mithril there, so you would think the dwarves would take an interest.
Yeah, there was one king who loved Mithril, and he was never in Middle-earth. So maybe they brought that, who knows? But, but it is said, they had, even when they colonized, probably they brought slaves, to be fair, I really do think that. Maybe we'll see that in the show. I want to see the bad aspect, I want to, but I want it to be portrayed, the bad aspect of colonialism. And this is, like robbing people of gold and mithril and whatnot, and then bringing slaves. And I really do think not everybody then spoke, or the random dude from Númenor, he probably didn't speak Quenya, right? But I think the elite spoke that.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. No, I mean, even in the Silmarillion, in the first age, we get the line about Quenya becoming a language of law, which I interpret as being basically
like Latin. It's like Latin, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, we still use Latin for medical classifications and things like that. Biology
and
stuff.
And you know what? You can play that out then later on. This is very. I mean, it gets very philosophical now, but this is welcome to our world. So if you like the Bible. When they preached, and when nobody during the medieval times could read effing Latin, like the scholars could, and the monks could, but nobody else. So you couldn't read the bloody Bible. You could just trust the dude standing there up in the, how's it called, preacher stand, chancel, whatever it's called in English, and then him preaching from a book. How would I know what's in there, right? And so that is also they can, do that maybe later on with Quenya, even, that not everybody can understand what some texts maybe say, or could be interesting.
We see that in the Houses of Healing scene too, when Aragorn is really, really frustrated by the herb master.
Yes.
And he has that clip where he says, I don't care if you call it Kingsfoil or blankety blank redacted.
Just bring me the thing.
Asea Arenion, just bring it to me. And then all of a sudden he name drops the Quenya, and all of a sudden the master's just like, oh, I didn't realize you. I thought you were just some ranger from the north.
Like,
you got a lot of sassy Aragorn.
I love sass. That he is so good in that chapter too. He just roasts the guy. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the concept of elf friends, which is mostly a Lord of the Rings concept, except it's slightly a Silmarillion concept as well, when you think about characters like maybe Hador and Húrin and so on. But the concept of elf friends seems to be really interesting to me because, well, I mean, the hobbits as well are named elf friends. Frodo is named an elf friend in one of the early chapters at Woody End by the Noldor. And I always, for a long time, I didn't really understand it, I don't think, what that meant. But it was just, it's kind of like a title that certain individuals are given by the elves. And
by the elves, exactly.
and it seems to be like a badge of honor.
Like knighting somebody.
Yeah, it is a bit sort of chivalrous almost. Yeah. I always found that really interesting because it seemed to almost be like a blessing as well. Like it was almost like you're an elf friend, and so you're important, and so you will be protected by the fact that you're important to the story that is playing out. And as somebody who's read other things since I read this as a child, and I understand fairy tales are better and legends and myth, it sort of feels like there's something meta going on with the elf friends thing where Tolkien is marking certain individuals as being important to the Elvish story. What do we think about elf friends and how that is presented?
Well, So in my Hobbit video, one of the things I happen to have to research and point out is that the hobbits are noted as being very suspicious of elves. They gradually, from their early days where they kind of work with the elves who are in the area, grow suspicious of elves, and they're afraid of them, and they don't want to talk about them. They won't talk to anyone who associates with them. And that's seen as a bad thing. And I kind of had to get into why would that be a bad thing? I'm like, okay, they don't like elves. Like, they're wrong, but they're free to be wrong. So why is it a big deal? And then this goes back to Sam too, the idea that Sam, one of the reasons we know he's a good guy from the very beginning is that he's just over the moon to see the elves. He wants to see them. He wants to learn more about them. He's just delighted whenever he encounters them. And in the narrative, we see that, of course, as being really, really good. Like, oh, little Sam, and he finally gets to see an elf, and that's so good. And we can trust Sam. He's a good guy, partly because he is so fond of the elves. So we know his head's on straight. We know he's headed in the right direction. And the conclusion I came to goes back to that idea where men as a people, they have this fall that's way back in their history, and it gets talked about. I didn't necessarily want to go there, but it does get talked about in Morgoth's Ring in the debate between Andreth and Finrod, where they're talking about what death is and what it means and why men seem to have such short, difficult, horrible lives, and still the elves are jealous of them. For an elf, historically, elves, they all abide by the same moral code, and Tolkien says explicitly that none of them ever served Morgoth, which is evil, basically, for the purposes of this conversation. None of them ever served Morgoth willingly or of their own accord. They were all sort of forced into it, and even those that did collaborate with him outright, there's only a handful of them, and their names are known, and they're accursed, and they're considered really, really weird. Whereas if it's any man who's ever done anything wrong, it's like that's all of them. They've all flirted with the idea of evil or getting power or stuff like that. The Edain are, there's only 3 peoples and they're vanishingly small, and there's a bunch of problems within each of the 3 houses, and they're still considered super, super special because of the one important thing they did, which was to look at Morgoth and say, yeah, no, I don't think so. Whereas all other men were at least indifferent to him or actively collaborated with him. So for an elf to look at a non-elf and say, oh, I get it, you're on the side of the elves, you're an elf friend, that is a huge moral distinction. It's the idea that you among mortals, most of whom we can't trust, you are trustworthy because you are in alignment with, again, going back to that whole idea of the theme and the Arda Unmarred.
But can I disagree a bit here? Because
Please
I really yeah, catch a breath, Lexi. I'll let the German talk. Okay, no, the thing is, the elves must know, they are the firstborn, right? So they know a lot. They were born before men came into this world. And I do think, as you said again before, they know a lot. They've seen a lot. They talked to the gods a lot. Some of them live with, the Ainur who helped to sing them into being. So they must know their lore, their knowledge must tell them stuff about men. I know the Valar very often are completely clueless about men. We know that. But still, they must understand that the concept of men is, yes, very different from theirs, but is marred by evil because Eru, God, created them as that. So they are more easily corrupted, but that is not their fault. That is God's fault because he created them like that. And then, Melkor came to the world and everything, was Morgoth, and everything was Morgoth's ring. He put all the evil, all the malice into the world. Men were born into this, right? Elves were not completely. Melkor, didn't have everything going on when elves were born in Quiven, and he came there, corrupted them, blah. But it was just the start of Morgoth as well. So when men came into the world, all the evil shit, came upon them. They were weaker than elves. They lived shorter lives. You act very differently when your life is shorter. You're not as noble because you literally have to survive. You just have this short time span and you want to make it a good one. You want to make it a good party. Obviously, you can be way more cooler and pretentious and like goody when you live forever, So I really do think the elves should have known that. And this is why I find actually this elf friend thing a bit unfair if we spin it this way, how you guys explain it, because the elves should know it's not men's fault. They are how they are.
But not necessarily whether or not it's the men's fault, but from a more pragmatic perspective.
Yes.
Look, I understand that you want to have a good time with your 65 years and go for it, sons of Wolfang, but I am not trusting you to cover my flank. I know. Trusted the elf friends.
But do you know, this is very I don't like that point about the elves. This is so pretentious because they should know it's not men's fault. Yes, like some of these evil men and men from Harad and Rune and Black Númenorians and blah, blah, blah. I obviously know what you're saying, right? But it's very pretentious to say then, you're granted an elf. Like, these people are literally fighting for their lives. And I always say, and I don't think Tolkien's concept of, working with evil is the same. Like, for example, I'm a big Star Wars fan, and in Star Wars, it's always very interesting. You have a character, like Thrawn, right? One of the coolest characters ever written. And he works with the baddies. He works for the Emperor, but he has another cause. He wants his people to survive. And he knows I have to work with the strongest fraction here on this board, on this chart, to help and aid my people because a bigger baddie is coming. So I can't work with the weak ones. I need, to work. So very often, when you look at wars, people fight for the wrong side, but just because they have to, because they were probably born on the wrong side of history. And so I don't know if Tolkien completely has this concept, like you see this in Star Wars very often, and you can even relate to evil characters. Obviously, I relate to the Emperor, but but this is very. Do you guys understand what I'm saying?
I understand the words that you're using. We're getting into Afrobeth territory here. We're talking about men and elves, very much.
Which I do not. I think I've read it 3 times and I still have no idea what they're talking about.
Really?
Well, a little bit. I'm exaggerating, but it's very. And I think there's 2 different versions of it, of course, at least. Yeah. So, which one is the right version, and what if it contradicts version B? And oh, look, we found this paper that surfaced in Tolkien's gum wrappers 40 years later that changes our perspective on the whole thing. I'm not bitter.
I think there's only one version of the Afrobeth that's in Morgoth's Ring.
Yeah.
The version that's in Morgoth's Ring, I think, is the definitive version.
I thought there was a version.
The commentary talks about there being other versions, but I think the version that we get is the definitive version.
Yeah, I think so.
So we're getting into
understand different things. So
we're getting into philosophical territory here with men and elves, and what's clear is that men don't understand elves and elves don't understand men. They're just not being.
Dwarves don't understand anything.
Well, the dwarves understand, certain.
Bite your tongue.
Dwarves don't get on with men either. I'm going to get on to dwarves with another team, another day.
Who's your team? Matt
from Nerd of the Rings I'm talking to him. Like, we haven't nailed down a date, but he's interested in doing it. Should I maybe say, Helen, why this series came about? Because this has come out on social media, so we talked about doing a debate between Helen and Matt over.
You wanted it to be like a talk show or something like that, like Jerry Springer.
Exactly like Jerry Springer.
I would watch that.
Yeah, I would watch that too.
bashing
It's a great
dwarves.
idea. I think it was a really good idea, but we. I understand, and I think probably Lexi, you understand, and I think probably most people watching understand that when Helen bashes the dwarves, she's being tongue-in-cheek about it, and I think you probably enjoy reading the dwarf stuff, but you're just not as big of a fan of dwarves, and you like just causing friction in the community, and
Sauron probably likes dwarves. I'm just going to throw that out there.
I'm a Morgoth.
Are you?
I don't think he likes the
Lieutenant?
Longbeards.
Oh no. Who likes the Longbeards?
Well, the Longbeards are the elf friends of the dwarves. You know, they're the ones that.
They're the
ones that get
Vanyar
along.
of the dwarves.
They are.
They don't do anything fun, like slaying Thingol, for instance.
So I was gonna ask about this, and this is a good moment for me to ask about this, is who is to blame for the long-standing beef between the elves and the dwarves, and why is it the dwarves?
It's Turin's to blame for everything.
Oh.
I don't see how it works, like, from a causal point of view, but metaphysically, I am positive.
Yeah, I'm with you there. But, I'm not a big Thingol fan, but, nah, but it's the dwarves. And then they tell lies, and then they run away. The ones who escape, the few that escape, then lie about the incident. Like, what the F?
Well, but hold on. The Silmarillion is told from an elven perspective. And so I mean, the bias could apply there. The elves could be lying as well. It's Thingol. He's probably not averse to, the Sindar are not averse to rewriting a little bit of history.
I don't think elven scholars lie. I don't think that's in there.
The Sindar Ministry of Truth.
Just imagine there's literally a building for that somewhere.
And isn't it in the first version, the thing that really kind of tips Thingol over the edge is that they want his wife? Isn't that the tale of the... Yeah, like in the... So this is like, this isn't canon. This is, I think, Book of Lost Tales, I want to say, too, that like the Naugla Fring, when it was... And we're still talking about gnomes and fairies and things like that. And I think one of they come and they make him the necklace, and he says, okay, here's what we agreed on. And they say, no, we each want an elf woman to take back with us. And the chief among us is going to take back Melian, who wasn't even, I don't think she was even named Melian at that point. And
no, she wasn't. I can't remember.
Thingol says, it's like Melilot or something. And Thingol comes back with, oh, the heck you say? And then that sort of triggers the whole thing. And then Baron shows up, and Baron's still an elf at this point, and he's leading his army of green elves.
Yeah.
So if that was an element to it at all, that kind of swings the pendulum against the dwarves.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is very not canon. But you're playing kind of both sides here with the Gondolin storyline with robot dragons and whatnot is canon, but this isn't.
Let Lexi have her own.
Let me have my.
We'll have our own headcanon where it comes to Tolkien. When you start talking Book of Lost Tales, you just pick and choose anyway, don't you?
Yeah, the difference is with Gondolin, it's very close to what actually is canon. It's just sort of an embellished version. And yes, we can cut out the mechanized dragons, but everything else is super close. Change a few names around, so that. It aligns. It's canon adjacent, I guess you could call it. Whereas the stuff with Thingol and the early versions of the whole Baron and Luthien and the Jewel of the Dwarves or the Necklace of the Dwarves, radically different from what the later versions ended up needing to be.
My Dwarven episode is going to be with Matt, hopefully, and also I've got this guy called the Dwaro Scholar coming on, who is he's a blogger and a kind of an expert in Neo-Kuzdal. So he's a linguist who works on. He's basically like doing the whole Tolkien subcreation thing with languages, but with Dwarvish. So he's invented loads of his own Dwarvish, corpus and syntax and so on, and he's creating his own Neo-Kuzdal.
That is amazing.
So interesting character. I've exchanged a couple of emails with him. Hopefully he'll be coming on. So that'll be an interesting... I'll
give that chat a dislike.
It'll be an interesting chat. He's worked on video games and stuff like that as well that needs bits of dwarvish dialogue. So he'll come in as like a consultant on that. It's pretty cool, I think.
That's really cool.
It's like Helen's like arch enemy.
Like, why would
natural
you do that?
nemesis.
Is there something we dislike about? I mean, I said it before. I don't like. Sometimes they're very pretentious and very like. But is there something you guys or Tolkien's version of elves where he could have gone, maybe another route?
So I don't know. I'm sure some of the people watching are probably familiar with Terry Pratchett and Discworld and all that. I don't know if either of you are, but
I haven't read all of it, but I do like Discworld.
Yeah, and so you've probably been exposed to the idea that in Discworld the elves are superficially somewhat similar to Tolkien's elves. They're tall and beautiful, and they kind of ride through the story, and they're untouched by any of the problems. But the difference is they are sadistic and malicious and evil and horrible, and they just go out of their way to torture mortals because they don't see the point. For them, they're not really of this earth. So he kind of gives
he mixes vampires. Yeah, I think this is literally a mixture of vampire. Yeah,
he gives them a hard sort of twist on your basic Tolkien always good, always lawful good elf person. So I guess I like the parts in Tolkien where you see bits of that sort of crazy elf peeking through, because they are there. I think I know we kind of made fun of it earlier, but the Tralalalali song is a good example of elves trolling, where they're just messing with the dwarves and with Bilbo just because they can, and they're sort of being very hedonistic, and it's midsummer, and they're eating and they're drinking and they're singing rude things at the dwarves, and they're just a little bit fey, you don't really know where you stand with them. The idea that the Mirkwood elves, for instance, are a little bit dangerous. You can't quite trust them. And then the Third Age, very like boring, buttoned up elves where no matter what they think of you, no matter what contempt they have for you, they're not going to do anything because they don't really do anything anymore. That's the part that's a little disappointing for me. I think I would prefer them to keep more of that wildness that other authors have sort of played off of and spun into more sort of different riffs on your standard, because Tolkien elf has kind of become a simplified version of the Tolkien elf has kind of become the fantasy elf standard, for better or worse. Yeah,
I feel exactly the same in here. Because after, obviously the Hobbit and then the Lord of the Rings were the first books I read. And then, after reading the Silmarillion for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, I was like, okay, but where are these elves like in the Lord of the Rings? Clearly he wrote this before. And why did elves change? And I was also, but in a way, I understood it looking at it literally cinematic wise. Obviously he didn't have a cinematic approach on this, but maybe he did, because the age of men now comes. Aragorn is crowned by Gandalf, basically saying this is the age of men now. So the Third Age is the elves leaving. They know they're leaving. When you're moving out of a house, do you do any more really cool stuff to your house? Do you paint the walls green like a month before you move out? Like all this, I think and the thing is, I think he didn't want, because we are so fascinated by these bloody elves. So if he would give them 3-dimensional characters, if he would give them more backstories, if he would give Galadriel more space, more things to say, more things to do, everybody would be like, yeah, Galadriel is my favorite character. But we don't want that. We want the fellowship. He wanted, like, you can identify with Aragorn or Sam or Frodo or whoever. He didn't want to put the focus like the Silmarillion was, or especially the First Age, and all these cities, Nargothrond, Gondolin, blah blah. The focus was on the elves because they were epic, cool. Like, maybe Númenor then in the Second Age, but do you know what I mean? Like he wanted to take away maybe the focus from the whole elven thing and give it to the fellowship and mankind. And so in a way I understand it. Still, I'm sad because this is literally a complete different version from elves in the Silmarillion. I'm like, are these the same people?
I was like, just where are my short-tempered, crusading, scheming, conniving, kinslaying elves?
Yeah.
Like, where are my awesome elves?
Yeah, why is Galadriel just a lady? Why doesn't she call herself effing queen of effing everything, bitches?
Well, because the Sylvan would rise up and depose her, but... which would be an awesome book in itself.
Yeah. Maybe that's another version. Let's just create this version.
Talking about the Fellowship, you've just touched on my answer to your question, which was what would you criticise in terms of the way that the elves are written, which is I think that Legolas is the least interesting member of the Fellowship.
He didn't say anything.
He doesn't have a lot of character development. A lot of his character arc is basically his relationship with Gimli. And Gimli has other stuff that's, interesting about his story arc that's not related to Legolas, but Legolas doesn't really. Legolas does have some good moments but I think I probably actually like movie Legolas more than I like book Legolas.
Strenuous objection.
Go on.
Okay, so again, this is something I've had to research and argue with my friends about, and having been a young 13-year-old devotee of Orlando Bloom Legolas, I've kind of had to, distance myself from that actively to really try and get a fresh perspective on Legolas. And to be fair, he's a pretty minor character. Tolkien himself says that he achieved the least of the Fellowship, but I had to trawl through all 3 volumes, just picking out his dialogue and finding the different situations that he was involved in and embroiled in. He's a punk. He is, in the book, he is an absolute, he is the closest we get to an elf who is that first stage. He's relatively young, he's impulsive, he's hot-tempered, he gets them into trouble all the time. That bit on Carthras where Gandalf is trying to keep the hobbits from just freezing to death and ending the whole quest before it really even gets started. And he's like, I'm going to make a joke about the sun and go dancing down the mountain on my little boots. And when he's running past...
No, I like that moment. No, that's my favourite Legolas moment.
He's running past Aragorn and Boromir, and he stops and he turns around and he waves at them. So, that's what we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with stoic, sort of always looks vaguely pained and mournful Legolas who's there to give exposition.
But he doesn't have dialogue. He doesn't say a lot.
No, he doesn't. He's a very minor character. But what we do get of his character, and then what we can piece together again from his implied backstory. And again, Tolkien admits this. He's like, Legolas doesn't really do much. But I think Tolkien's idea of Legolas is very different than the one we get in Peter Jackson.
Oh, very, very.
And he's way more goofy than people give him credit for. He's kind of a spaz, and it's precious.
That is the young, this is why he gets lines like, I feel so young, they want to point out, they are literally elves that like Galadriel have seen it all, who were even born in a different world. And he is, Legolas
knows stories that the other members of the Fellowship don't know because of cultural reasons, the Rivendell story and stuff like that. But he definitely, there is a kind of juvenility to him. I don't know if that's a word, but he's young at heart for an elf compared with all the other elves that we meet in the story. He's definitely a little bit immature.
Yes, exactly.
So I think my opinion on elves is that they are the genesis of the Legendarium. They are the kind of the linchpin of the whole thing, and this is where Tolkien's heart really was. His heart was always in the Silmarillion. He kept coming back to the Silmarillion, and that was the elven story. As far as the way that they're used in the Lord of the Rings, we've talked about this several times. They're used as a kind of device for him to talk about the mortality issue, which is one of the most interesting aspects of the elves. So that's why you have a different impression of the elves in the Lord of the Rings than you do in the Silmarillion. the Silmarillion investigates different aspects of elven culture, and you get the Ardamard concept come through, and you get the kind of the mythic feeling of the elves being part of the story of the origins of evil and how their corruption leads to the world that we live in, or the world that the people of Middle-earth live in. You can't really divide elves from Middle-earth. Middle-earth is the elven story. It is fundamental to Tolkien's world. And, why I brought up the elf friends earlier as well is because the way that we look at mortals is through an elven lens very much in terms of the Silmarillion. The mortals that we get stories about, they're looked at as being elf friends because that's the way that the elves look at them. I mean, I really, really love the elves. If anybody tells me that they don't enjoy the elves, but they're a Tolkien fan, I just think, well, you don't understand Tolkien. You just don't get it. You're not paying attention. Let's
I'm being
shoot up to
pointed
Lexi
at.
and being pointed at.
Because this is like the wrong.
This is why I'm not on camera. I have no sense of direction.
That man's an imposter. That man is the imposter. There can't be two Spider-Men. Let's take them both in.
I think the big thing for the elves, for how I tend to look at them and their role in Tolkien's imagination, like you said, they were the genesis of the mythology. When he was making up languages and he was writing the earliest stories where humans could still sail way back in recorded, very, very remote, but still part of recorded human history. They could sail and hope to still encounter an elf. This was an early conception. Even then, he had the idea that the elves were super cool, and he really couldn't stop himself from writing about them, but he knew that their end had to be tragic, and it had to be, even though it was very different than kind of what the later forms became. From the beginning, it was always a story of exile and not being able to get back home and being trapped in a world that was sort of falling apart from underneath you. And it was very tragic, so much so that an early death would seem a matter for envy for the elves. So while I tend to prefer the young, springy, hopeful elves that really want to get out there and shake things up and do something and make a name for themselves, and they're subject to all the normal human flaws of pride and greed and resentment and all of that good stuff that makes for a really interesting story and usually a very tragic story. I think that what's central to Tolkien's conception of elves and what sets them apart from all of the many versions of fantasy sort of elf races that have come since then is that they are locked into this tragic end. There's no avoiding it, and it's really the heart of how they're characterized. So those are, and it makes me sad, but that's like Sam says, and I think it's in the film, he sees them going by. He says a different version in the book where he's talking about the elves leaving Middle-earth, and he says, I don't know why, but it makes me sad that they can't stay, and that they're sort of doomed before they even really got going.
Do you think that it was a mistake for the elves to be translocated to Valinor in the Years of the Trees?
Yeah.
Because, by the Third Age, they're all leaving and so on. The Years of the Trees are gone. They've been and gone. But I think in Ardor Unmarred, I think the elves, in Ardor Unmarred, there is no Valinor. There is just the world, and it's all one blissful paradise. But then I think the Valar make a mistake. And Tolkien wrote about this. Tolkien wrote about, whether or not the Valar made mistakes, and he was very staunchly defending the Valar. But
Númenor is more obvious that they made a big mistake in giving Númenor to mankind. This is more obvious, but I agree. I would say, they made a mistake. They were not born for nothing in Cuiviénen.
They weren't supposed to be living amongst the gods. They weren't supposed to be there.
They're not gods.
Definitely get that feeling.
They are Eru's firstborn, born in another land, born of that soil, and and the sun and moon came for them. Like, it's very selfish of the Valar. I don't like them so.
I sympathize hard with the Valar. A lot of times I think that their decisions are problematic, if I can borrow that word, but I don't know that I could come up with a better one. I don't know that leaving the elves, given that Arda is marred and Morgoth is actively hunting for the elves and hoping to exterminate them, if not just, torture them into slaves to his will. I don't know what would happen if the Valar decided to say, all right, we'll do our best to protect you from the continent-sinking conflict that is about to occur. Good luck with that, and we won't interfere with your free will. I think that the relocation it created a lot of problems that the Valar didn't necessarily foresee, at least not from what I can tell. But again, I'm not a Valar. But...
Are you not?
No, I'm not.
But Lexi, this is to me you're godlike, Lexi. Anyway, but this is very similar to just imagine somebody saying, "Okay, I want to save the rainforest. I'm taking all the trees out. I'm ripping all the trees out in Brazil and putting them somewhere in my garden so I can." That doesn't solve the problem of the effing rainforest.
If
they should have gone there. If the
only alternative is the rainforest will be nuked, then maybe we should start conserving some of those trees. And we just don't know. We don't know.
But they knew he couldn't have gotten all of them, and
he might have. They could have the mightiest of the Valar.
They could have just come to Arda like they did before and aided them, and not stayed in their land and say, "Oh yeah."
I don't know. I do not assume to fathom the mind of the Valar. I think there's a lot going on that the elves aren't necessarily aware of and therefore don't record in their history. But I will say that Ulmo was against it, and we always trust Ulmo, and we think that he would, if anyone knew what was up, it would have been him. And I will also say that in Nature of Middle-earth, Elwë, who later becomes the much reviled Thingol, he says, "No, guys, it'll be cool. They told us we can leave whenever we want, and it's just until Morgoth is defeated anyway." Now, this is like version, I think, 6 of something like 8 or 10 different versions of the debate that the fathers of the elves have when they return back from their little trip to Valinor. But Elwë says, "No, it's fine. We can go there if we want. We can stay there as long as we want. We can come back at any time," which is not at all the version that we get in the Silmarillion. So maybe something like that, offering Valinor would have been the best decision. You can come here if you want. You can stay if you want. You can leave when you want.
It's like they should have treated it like a holiday retreat.
Versus once you come, there's no going back. And then, of course, that leads to the whole thing of Feanor saying, "Well, why shouldn't I go back? You can't stop me. You're not my mom. My mom's dead."
Yeah.
My mom's dead.
She's
and
weaving
making tapestries.
Yeah, she's weaving all my great deeds, and my son's deeds. So yay, go for her.
Poor Muriel.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah.
Helen, so, closing thoughts.
Yes.
Closing thoughts. I really, I'm a very visual person, and even when I read a book, I visualize content. I like the elves being in the story because they are like the middle part of this whole thing. Just imagine there would just be men, even some powerful men versus a god. Or versus a demigod with Sauron and all that, right? That would, what kind of fight is that? You need the elves there, to be the in-between element, basically. And so mankind has a chance. And this is why very often, even in, the cinematic movies, Jackson gave us scenes which were not in the books, by the way, like the elves aiding at Helm's Deep and stuff like that, because we need that to understand and so a war, because we know how war works, right? Tolkien knew that. So you have this. I'm not saying this is one of the elements why he invented these elves, but it's cool to have this element in there. And then he adds, a little spice with somebody like Gandalf and Saruman, to have another magic counterpart of this overpowered Melkor being, and then later Sauron. So I really like that you have these different factions. And this is why I like the elves in the story as well.
So it sounds like you're saying, I'm going to distill your opinion down to like a really short summary. It sounds like you're saying elves are like superheroes in Middle-earth. They're there basically. They're there to fight against the supervillains, basically.
Yeah, because otherwise mankind, like, first of all, it would be super boring. And then it's like, what kind of fight is that even? So you need this hope, and they are the hope. And this is how often Tolkien, gives us little things of elves aiding, but they do. And, like the battle under the trees, you don't even know that Thranduil also helped, This was one of the reasons why Rohan and Gondor did not fall, because Thranduil stopped them from coming up northeast. And these things, like, maybe they are, the, Avengers.
Somebody needs to draw a fan art of this.
I love it. Can we call Timbo, please?
In a video of mine, a lore video, I did actually have the Avengers from the first Avengers movie, and then it was a video that I did about the wizards, and I put the Astari faces on the faces of the Avengers. People in the comments enjoyed that. I spent a lot of time photoshopping that. This is why I don't bring out videos more regularly, is because I'll spend forever on like 10 seconds of photoshopping something.
It's so worth it.
It is.
Or maybe it's
it is
not.
When you get one comment on it and somebody's like, yeah, I really like that you did that with the Avengers, and
it makes your whole week.
It does, yeah. And
damn.
I love the comments when they're nice.
Yeah,
I even like I even like the weird ones. I'm like,
Okay, so guys, I'm going to ask you to just talk about what you've got coming up on your channels and what you're working on at the moment. So let's start with Helen, because every time I've gone to the two of you, I've got started with Lexi.
What
are you working on? What are you working on?
I don't know. When is this coming out?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we're recording on Hobbit Day. So maybe tell me what you've got coming out next week. You have been scheduling recently. You've been trying to figure out what you've got coming up on your channel. So you must have an idea.
Yeah, but I forgot because I'm always so confused. No, I have Bloodline stuff coming out. I work on a lot of series about Witch King stuff. Wars in the North, Angmar. But that will probably be out. So go to my channel and just check out my epic playlist. I like the baddies, so I have a lot of stuff on them. And I am writing on a shorter version of a ring comparison video. I saw people really like that idea to talk about comparing the One Ring and the idea and mythology behind it and other versions. I'm German. Part of my mythology of the German mythology is der Ring der Nibelungen, the Ring of the Nibelung, which is also connected to the North mythology object, the dwarf Alberich and all that stuff. And then there's the Ring of Geek, which is like in Greek mythology, like a ring that makes... Yeah. I'll talk a lot about rings, I like bling. I'm the fellowship of the bling. So I'll do but this is complicated to write because it's a lot of, research. So, but that will drop one day. Yeah.
Cool. That sounds awesome. I'm definitely watching. And Lexi, so what have you got coming up on your channel in the next few weeks?
So my next project that is coming up that I'm a little bit intimidated by, to be honest, is I've been trying to do this epic series on magic in Middle-earth, where I'm really just trying to find every example I can think of and categorize it and retrofit it, just like Tolkien would have done. You know, he would approve of this. I'm being very pedantic, I'm being very completionist, and I'm trying, my next installment on that is scheduled to be light, which I don't know if you guys noticed this at all when you were reading Lord of the Rings, but Tolkien kind of enjoys talking about light and darkness and shadows, and so that's something that I'm currently researching. And then other than that, I'm just excited to come out with a few more videos that are a little bit more theory based and a little bit more speculative. And then I'm also trying to, I have a couple friends who just started reading the books for the first time this fall. And so I'm trying to, in honor, I know they text me the most brilliant questions at like 2 a.m. They say things like, Theoden died before he could talk to Eowyn. This isn't like the movies, and I'm upset. So I'm planning to do a series for sort of newer fans who are maybe encountering some of this for the first time, and they go on Reddit and they just get drowned in all of these obscure references, trying to kind of parse that out. So yeah, hopefully exciting stuff, and we'll see if I can actually get to any of it.
Brilliant. Sounds good. Thank you so much, guys, for coming on. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to leave things right there, I think. Goodbye. Perfect. And we'll see you next time. We'll see you next time with dwarves, hopefully. So we'll have fun talk about those. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.